is it okay for me to take? Is it safe for me to take this? Is it an anabolic steroid? But specifically, I'm bald because I took a lot of creatine. Do you need to drink extra gallons of water during the day like the gym bros? Is there any research or evidence that's going to show that creatine could have a substantial impact negatively on your kidneys?
This drives me nuts.
I think the last time we actually spoke in person like this was during like the peak of COVID. I feel like you were like the first person that I actually got to talk to when we were in lockdown, and I'm pretty sure that would have been almost 5 years ago, I think, at this point.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's absolutely insane. I wanted to go right into it and just first, this is Scott Forbes, and you're still at Brandon University?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, and you're just tons and tons of research on creatine. I've got a lot of myths I want to ask you and sort of just roll off of, but then I wanted to ask you too right off the bat, is there anything recently that you've seen in creatine research that's like even more profound than you may have felt in the past? Is there anything new that you're like, holy crap, this is pretty freaking cool?
Not really. I think there's obviously more and more research coming out on creatine, and some of the non-muscle benefits are interesting, but still preliminary. Research takes time. Whether it has a big effect on cognition, for example, or some of the bone health benefits of creatine is pretty interesting. But I think those are all pretty preliminary still. There's more and more research coming out on creatine in females, which I think is really interesting and cool.
Yep. Okay, so that was going to be one of the first things that I wanted to ask. As I'm looking through my giant sheet of questions, was like, okay, a lot of girls will ask, like, well, is it okay for me to take? Is it safe for me to take this? Is it an anabolic steroid? But specifically, for some reason, it tends to still have this stigma with women. So could you sort of, I don't know, maybe talk about why you think that is, but then also provide some answers to maybe just right off the bat too, what it is specifically, and safe, not safe, and then what you're seeing with how it works with women.
For sure. So first of all, creatine is just made up of 3 amino acids. So those amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So if you're consuming protein, you're consuming amino acids just put together. So it's not a steroid. So yes, creatine does give your cells a little bit more energy and allows you to train a little bit harder and makes your muscles a little bit bigger and stronger. So it's an anabolic supplement, I guess, but it's not a steroid. Basically once it gets into your bloodstream, most of it is taken up into the muscle. So about 95% of the creatine in the body is stored in muscle tissue, but it's stored in other places as well. For example, your brain, bone tissue, other places. Your testes, for example, has creatine in it as well. So the other 5% is made up by those other tissues. And basically once it gets into the muscle, it gets converted into phosphocreatine. And phosphocreatine is like stored potential energy used for high intensity exercise. So it's a benefit anytime you're trying to do some sort of explosive activity, throw a shot put, sprint up some stairs, do some explosive deadlifts, for example. They could all benefit from creatine supplementation.
How long would you see that storage or that energy usage happening before that would deplete, and then the body would sort of shift gears into another type of energy?
Yeah, for sure. So the phosphocreatine energy system is pretty small. Maybe it has a capacity of about 8 seconds, but if you supplement with creatine, maybe you can, push it to 9 to 10 seconds. So that's essentially what creatine does. So it's not this like profound thing that's going to make you allow you to sprint for like hours on end. But it can basically allow you to do maybe 1 or 2 more reps in the gym. And if you can translate that over time, you can get bigger and stronger muscles.
Okay, so going with the women, as far as a girl taking this, has there been any research on negativity of creatine in any specific impact of that gender, or is there anything that you have seen that could be like, hey, we should hold up here a little bit when we're talking about women taking it?
Nothing. And I think a lot of the fear that women have with regards to creatine supplementation is the gain in body mass. So you will gain a little bit of body mass. And the way that creatine works is once it gets into the cell, it will pull a little bit of water into the cell. So you might retain a little bit more water. But I like to think of it as like hydrating the cell. And it's also actually stimulates the muscle to grow. So it's actually an important thing to pull some water in and cause a little bit of cell swelling. That stimulates muscle growth. And we've actually done a couple reviews recently looking at the impacts of creatine on fat mass. And I can conclusively say it doesn't increase fat mass in any capacity. And it might actually help you lose a little bit of fat mass. So you're improving your body composition. So even though your weight might be increasing, you're gaining muscle and losing a little bit of fat.
So when people hear that, I think like when people hear you say initially, like, oh, you're going to be retaining water, they're probably ignoring the last part where you're like, oh, you're going to gain a little bit of muscle. You might or you might lose a little bit of fat. Actually, I still feel like they're going to, for some reason, ignore the part that you're probably going to see a nice shift in your body comp, but they're still going to come back and say, well, what about that retaining of water? Like, what does that mean? Is that really the way you described is like you're hydrating the muscle to actually to perform things and to perform tasks. Is like that water retention? Is it really that substantial? Do you need to drink extra gallons of water during the day like the gym bros? What is the severity or the degree of that?
Yeah, so it's much smaller than what people suggest. And there was actually a really cool study where they looked at the intracellular water, so water within the muscle cell, to skeletal muscle mass. And they calculated that ratio. And they calculated that ratio before and after 8 weeks of supplementation and training. And they actually showed that ratio actually remained the same after 8 weeks of training, suggesting that what I think is in the first week or two, you do pull a little bit of water in, so that ratio will change, but that stimulates the muscle to grow, and then you have more muscle mass. So that ratio is actually the same after 8 weeks of training compared to at the start. So it's not this like kind of profound effect that people think that it's going to have. And actually your body does a pretty good job of regulating how much water is in your cell versus out of the cell and all the contents within it as well. After 8 weeks, that completely balances itself out.
Okay, so 8 weeks, guys supplementing, or the subjects were supplementing, maybe early on that first week or two, water retention's a little bit higher. By the end of 8 weeks, they go and they look at the ratio. It's exactly the same as what it was prior to when they started to supplement. So their body actually adapted and adjusted, and there really was no noticeable water retention.
Absolutely, yeah. So we know that muscle itself is about 73% water. So if you gain more muscle, you're also going to gain a little bit of water as well. So that's exactly what they showed.
Okay. Now, on this water discussion, one thing that I wanted to bring up too is like if I talk to a sprinter, so we train a lot of, it's funny because we train a lot of football players, and when we tell them to take creatine, it's like, yes, I get to take creatine. It's like this rite of passage that like now all of a sudden they can go tell their mom and dad like, yeah, Dane said that we can take creatine because Scott Forbes said it's okay. And I literally tell them to go to PubMed and type in Scott Forbes in PubMed, read all his research and show me anything negative about creatine. So I will say that's my literally my sales pitch for creatine at the gym. Nice. But the irony behind it is that you tell a football player to do this, and it's like the rite of passage. It's like, yes, I get to go take creatine. I'm going to get bigger and stronger, and maybe it'll help me with a concussion, as terrible as that sounds. Now with sprinters, you'll tell them to take creatine, and they'll say that, well, what about cramps? What about, am I going to be more prone to an injury? Or is this going to happen? And I wanted to bring that up in regards to this. Is there any recent research that would show that creatine supplementation could indeed lead to higher levels of cramping? Is there anything that shows that it could be an issue, for sprinters or for any type of speed sport in that regard?
There is no research to support that. And there's actually research to show the contrary, that basically you have reduced incidence of muscle cramps or muscle injuries. So that's like completely anecdotal evidence that people are telling you this. And if you actually look at the science, it's one of the safest supplements. I'm actually just reviewing a paper. It's under review right now, but it's assessed all the creatine safety, and it's massive. And I can tell you from that particular article that there's no safety concerns associated with creatine supplementation.
So that's like an interesting thing, because I almost wanted to go into the age factor first, but I think we talked about this the last time 5 years ago. My wife had a stroke in 2018, and I had reached out. I was trying to figure out, like, how could she recover from this, and I remember reading at the time. Now I did want to go into this specific aspect, was trauma and recovery from brain trauma, and I had just stumbled upon a creatine paper around brain trauma and concussions, and I reached out to Dr. Richard Kreider, and he was like, "Look, I can't tell you what to do. I'm not a doctor, but I would suspect it's not going to harm, and in fact, it may help and enable her to recover from the stroke by using creatine." And she was pregnant, and I wanted to go into this part. She was pregnant, and I think I might have even talked to you at this point. The timeline is, I don't remember the timeline that well, but he was even saying that there was some evidence that women, as they breastfeed, they're using creatine with their infants. The infant will pull more creatine from the women, and he believed that it would be reasonable for, one, a pregnant woman, or two, a woman who's breastfeeding, to also supplement creatine because of the needs for the infant and for the woman who's breastfeeding. So I guess in regards to safety, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any evidence? Is there anything recently, because that would have been 2018 to 2020, that you could comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually did a stroke survivor creatine and resistance training paper. It was just a small pilot study, but we showed that it was safe in that population, so there's no adverse side effects. And they improved their 6-minute walking performance, so kind of a functional test that we do. There was no other improvements with the creatine supplementation, but the resistance training was really effective. So,
do you know what type of strokes they were recovering from, or was it just any in general?
We just included all,
Okay.
and I think there was only 6 participants in the study. So
Okay.
yeah, it was a pretty small study, and basically half them got creatine, half them got placebo. But so a small study, but at least we showed that it's a safe supplement to take in that population.
Okay.
And
so
then,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
and then with regards to during pregnancy, I know there's research that's being conducted, and actually I'm going to Germany next month, middle of March, and basically there's a presenter there that's going to be talking on kind of the latest research, but it seems promising from that perspective. There's still not a huge amount of data as well to show kind of the safety profile. So if you're really cautious, then maybe you wouldn't supplement with creatine during pregnancy or while breastfeeding. But I'm pretty sure the evidence is going to say that it's safe.
What's up, guys? Our podcast and our channel are sponsored by our own strength training app, Peak Strength. The entire focus of Peak Strength is to provide you guys with the absolute best sports performance app that you could ever imagine. We build out the programs on the back end. We take in all of these different decisions that we learned here on site at Garage Strength so that we can then apply it to you so you can improve your training. So if you guys want to improve your overall sports performance, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength. You'll get a free week of training, and then you can start getting on those gains, get those reps done so that you can become a champion. Now, let's get back to the video. Peace. I think, okay, so take that now, and if we think about safety, I feel like you might have posted something. I read so many of the creatine posts and the papers on ADHD children and creatine, and I don't know if this is me just making this up, but I feel like there's even evidence of that helping with the cognition, and maybe this is what you were touching on early on. Is there any, and relating into the safety of, age related, when is it too early? So maybe touch on that aspect, safety and precautions that you should have or not have, or it's not a big deal based off of age. So, and then we could get into the cognitive aspects later, but let's say, is there an age that's too early to be taking creatine because of a negative aspect?
To answer that question scientifically, there's no age that's too early, which is probably going to blow some people's minds, and they're going to be like, what? Like, no, you can't be giving like children like creatine that's going to like destroy their kidneys. But no, there's maybe 10 to 12 adolescent studies that have shown enhanced exercise performance, and it's also safe in that population as well. And there's clinical populations where, they have creatine deficiency syndrome. So they have basically trouble getting creatine into their muscles or into their brain. And they supplement those children with creatine. And then you mentioned traumatic brain injuries or concussions previously. There's actually a paper showing that in children, again, following a traumatic brain injury, that they can benefit from creatine supplementation to help with the recovery. So we know it's safe. I have 2 younger kids, and they'll try creatine here or there, but I'm not like giving them creatine or supplements all the time. I think there's other things to focus on, just like proper training technique, eating lots of fruits and vegetables, getting good sleep, not playing video games 24/7. Those are probably more important things than
Not being on TikTok.
Yeah.
I think that's the funny part, is like sometimes parents will actually ask me these things, and I'm like, you're letting your kid go on TikTok all day, but like you're worried about them crushing creatine? Like, come on, dog. Like, you gotta, like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
So to recap that, you're saying age doesn't seem to matter, especially when they're having, adolescents that might either have some type of traumatic brain injury, or they do have an inability to process or to utilize creatine. They're seeing that in these specific populations, not only is it safe, but it's also effective for recovery or for those specific disorders.
That's correct. Yeah. And also just, healthy adolescents as well. It's been shown to be safe and effective.
Okay. So maybe that's where, I did want to go into, you mentioned the destroying the kidneys, and it's like, you'll hear the high protein diets ruin kidneys, and then you'll hear creatine is going to slaughter your kidneys. Is there any sense or any research or evidence that's going to show that creatine could have a substantial impact negatively on your kidneys?
So in the recommended doses, no. There are a few published case studies, but often those case studies are confounded with, they're not just taking one supplement, they're taking 20 different supplements at one time, and they're often taking extreme doses, and then they present with kidney failure, kidney disease. So one particular case study that I want to kind of highlight, they're taking over 200 grams of creatine per day. So
Per day?
per day. Yeah.
So that's like 50 or no, what is that? I guess it's like 20 times the recommended dose about.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just absolutely unnecessary. And in those instances, yeah, maybe there's some evidence that creatine can hurt your kidneys, but if you're taking it in the recommended doses, there's no evidence that creatine causes any sort of kidney dysfunction.
Okay, so recommended doses, zero evidence that creatine is going to cause any type of kidney or creatine, any type of recommended dose with creatine, you'll see no negative impact on your kidneys.
Correct.
Where could you draw the line, or could you say like, well, listen, like you want to take 10, let's say, because I remember I still use the 0.1 gram per kilogram of body weight as the formula that you taught me in 2020. And I still use that as I guess maybe that's the first question. How do you now, what do you do for a recommended dosage?
Yeah, so that 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight is still probably the best kind of dosing strategy. And we've shown it to be effective in a variety of different populations and on a variety of different tissues. If you're not good at math and that 0.1 grams per kg is too challenging to figure out, for the muscle benefits, I suggest 5 grams per day. And for if you want bone or brain benefits, I suggest around 10 grams per day.
Okay. So that's pretty cool. So it's like maybe this might be jumping to conclusions a little bit, but you would say within reason, like let's say I'm just thinking about a 140 kilo guy could take 15 to 20 grams of creatine and would see muscular and likely possibly some cognitive benefits. Would you say 20 grams would be like, all right, I think you're probably good on 20 grams a day?
Yeah, 20 grams seems to be like that upper range, but there's been some recent studies, for example, with sleep deprivation, we know that impacts your cognition. So they just gave one dose of creatine, and it was about 30 or 35 grams of creatine that they provided. And they showed improvements in cognitive performance. So, if you're just doing it one time, maybe 30 grams would be kind of that higher dose. If you're going to take it repeatedly, yeah, I suggest kind of around that 10 gram range. But yeah, if you're around 14 or 15 grams, that's perfectly safe as well. Dr. Darren Kandow, a good friend of mine from Saskatchewan in Canada, he just finished a 2-year training study and in postmenopausal females, and they used 0.14 grams per kilogram of body weight. So a little bit higher than that 0.1 that we normally kind of recommend. So they wanted to go kind of to ensure that they were getting enough creatine and that people weren't going to be like, oh, the dose wasn't high enough. So they actually went 0.14 grams per kg. And again, no adverse effects associated with it compared to the placebo, and showed some positive bone benefits as well. Okay,
so I want to get into the postmenopausal women, but I also want to write this down. I already have too many notes on my one page. I remember reading the paper on the sleep deprivation because when we were traveling a lot last year, I remember reading, okay, if I'm going through a time change and I'm going to lose sleep, if I can go 10 to 15 grams of creatine, and let's say over a 3-day time frame, I have like a 3-hour sleep period and then a 6-hour sleep period, and then I'm going to have disruption in my pattern until I can get my, I guess, circadian rhythm operating based off the sunlight of wherever we were. Traveling, in different time zones. What you're saying off of that, and if I remember correctly, is like my cognitive, it wouldn't necessarily be a direct impact on my sleep patterns improving right away, but what would end up happening is that my decision making, my cognitive awareness would be improved, and possibly more positive if I was supplementing, in this case, a higher amount of creatine while being deprived of sleep?
Yeah, partially correct. There's actually some new evidence that creatine might influence sleep as well.
Oh, shit. Okay.
So yeah, I know. So yeah, Dr. Darren Kando did another study in females actually, and they showed improved sleep quality. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
pretty
Okay.
pretty cool. So it could also just improve your sleep in general. And then there's an animal study where they showed that basically they required less sleep on creatine. So I wouldn't generally recommend people just get less sleep. We know all the benefits and the power of sleep,
Hmm.
but yeah, definitely in those situations, I would consume creatine. I think it's super important. And if I'm deprived and traveling, I definitely take a little bit more creatine. Maybe that 15 or 20 grams to try to get some of the further benefits.
Yeah, 100%. That makes sense. Okay. Now, when you were talking about the postmenopausal women, they were using 0.14 grams per kilogram of body weight. Is there anything to be said that somebody who has more muscle mass per, let's say the body weight is equal, but they have more muscle mass, should they be taking more creatine than the person who doesn't have as much muscle mass? Is there, because I guess in my initial reaction is like, oh well, postmenopausal women are smaller. Maybe they actually need more. And I don't know if that's accurate. Is there anything along those lines where you might see, does that change at all in your recommendation of the dosage based off of that study?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's lots of little factors that can influence dose and kind of how much creatine you might want to ingest as well. Even like the amount of fiber or percentage of fiber types or fast twitch fibers that you
Oh,
have.
oh,
They take up a little bit more creatine than slow twitch fibers. So I don't know if you know any like explosive athletes that have a lot of fast twitch fibers, but yeah, they might use a little bit more creatine than like the endurance athletes that have a little bit more slow twitch fibers. Um, we base our recommendations based off body mass just for simplicity. So it's a little bit more accurate than like just giving absolute amounts because people can differ in size quite a bit. So we try to account for that. If we could base it off of muscle mass, that would probably be even better. So yeah,
it's just that's pretty
I don't know.
hard. That's like a lot of people may not have the access to a resource to help them figure out how much muscle mass they have.
Yeah, and now we know that even like DEXA scans are being kind of criticized, I guess, in the academia world. Not
Hmm.
criticized, but just like with anything, there's limitations.
Hmm.
So even a DEXA scan, you get lean tissue mass, and lean tissue mass encompasses, water, skin, um, uh, even the protein in bone as well. So there's other things involved in calculating lean tissue mass, and only about 40 to 60% is actually muscle mass with a DEXA scan. So even
Okay.
if you have access to a fancy machine like a DEXA scan, it's still not a perfect tool as well. So yeah, it's very challenging to do. So it's much easier just to measure body mass.
Okay. So you were talking about when you were talking about the fast twitch with the fiber types. I immediately was like, is there any evidence? Is there any evidence on creatine supplementation and improvement of endurance aspects in performance of endurance sports? Let's say marathon, let's say 800-meter run, speed skaters, something like that, all the way up to a marathon or a triathlete.
I personally think there could be some benefits. There hasn't been as much research in that area, but if you watch races, for example, those endurance races in cycling, for example, there's key moments in the race where you like sprint super hard to get away from the pack, and I think creatine could be a benefit in those situations. And there is some evidence to show that high intensity intervals interspersed in endurance or continuous exercise is improved with creatine supplementation. There was actually a study done from the Australia Institute of Sport that showed improvements in kind of a 1 kilometer and 4 kilometers final sprint in a 120 kilometer race in cyclists. So basically at the end, you can go a little bit faster, and maybe you can get those improvements with creatine supplementation. And then there's actually some animal data. So they used chronic low frequency stimulation. Essentially, they zap the rat's muscles just at a small intensity, so a little bit of electricity, and it causes a muscle contraction. And they'll do that for long periods of time. So in this particular study, they were doing it 12 hours a day that they were doing that. So a little bit bad for the rats, I guess. But it's like extreme endurance training for these rats. So they get really good improvements in mitochondria. And but one of the kind of side effects of that is that they actually lose some of their fast twitch fibers and fast twitch characteristics. But if the rats supplement it with creatine, they retain those fast twitch characteristics. So to me, an endurance athlete, there's certain times when you want to use those fast twitch fibers. Yeah. And you want good oxidative fibers as well, slow twitch fibers for the endurance performance. That's the most beneficial for those athletes. But there are key moments where those fast twitch fibers come into play, and I think that's where creatine can be a benefit.
Yeah, I was almost thinking about like you're basically what you're saying is, okay, let's say that there's a theoretical endurance cyclist and they're taking creatine. They got a VO2 max at like 85 or something crazy, right? Like off the charts. If they're supplementing creatine that entire time, they're likely going to maintain more of their fast twitch fiber than had they not supplemented creatine that entire time. And then on top of that, when they're strategically, the cool thing with cycling, I think, is that they've got so many different metrics that they're reading on the bike, and they know based off of VO2 max, based off of watts per kilo and stuff like that, they know that, and they know the opposition who they're going against, that when they can make a strategic push and a strategic sprint, they know how long they can do that for based off their FTP that they're calculating beforehand. And now they're looking at it and they're going, okay, based off of my output, if I have more fast twitch fibers from creatine and I'm still supplementing with my creatine, when I'm going to make that push for the strategic movement to try and either chase the pack or pull the pack forward and try and just outlast them, it's highly likely that creatine is going to be beneficial in that case.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
You're a big endurance nerd too, hey?
Yeah, I do like it. I think endurance training is one of the craziest. It's literally like robotic. It's like programming. And when you were saying this, I think that you guys should be responsible. I'm going to put all this pressure on your lab right now that I demand that you take something as simple as like the 4x4 minute or something like that, like the Norwegian protocol that they, and I think what's his name, Dr. Steven, he's actually in Norway, but he's an American. I can't remember his name because I did want to interview him on a podcast. But let's say you take the 4x4 minute, you do a 4-minute push on a treadmill or on an assault bike or something, and then you rest for 2 minutes or something, and you repeat that, whatever it might be. See if the individual on creatine versus off creatine over a 6-week time frame, is there an improvement in things like VO2 max that you would see more of an increase in those things? I'm interested in that mainly because I was thinking, well, even if you take a high-intensity interval workout like that and you can push harder for those 4 minutes, you would need your heart to also adapt the heart adaptation would have to be there as well. And I'm just thinking, like, could creatine, and I don't know if this has ever even been looked at, could creatine theoretically lead to a higher VO2 max or something like that? Or, it likely would lead to like a better 1 hour test or anything along those lines. I don't know. I think it's an interesting dilemma because a lot of these people would end up saying, well, the problem is the weight gain. Like I have swimmers that'll say that to me, well, what about me gaining weight? A girl right now, what about me gaining weight? It's like, first of all, let's just say you do gain 2 pounds of muscle. First, that's going to help you put out more force. But second, let's dial in your nutrition that much more. Let's lose a little bit from having better nutrition. so that if you're on the bike or if you're in the pool or if you're, a runner in this case, you could see an impact from that. So I wanted to pressure you to do a 4x4 minute test twice a week, and then you have half the subjects on creatine, half the subjects aren't on creatine.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, we've done high intensity interval training study with and without creatine using shorter intervals.
Okay.
They trained 3 times a week, and they had 3 different protocols. So one was like a sprint protocol where they did 6-second bursts of activity. Another one was like the Wingate, the 30 seconds
Yep.
bursts of activity. And then we also did one, I call it the Little method, because John Little was, he's kind of an interval training guru, and he created this 1 minute on, 1 minute off protocol. So we used that protocol as well. And the creatine the interval training was very effective. The creatine didn't help improve VO2 max or time trial performance.
How long was it?
It was a 4-week training study. So maybe we got to do a little bit longer. And
I wonder if
you try that Norwegian protocol.
Yeah, if you did the Norwegian protocol and they did like twice a week, like maybe if they did something like Norwegian protocol once a week, the Ronstadt protocol for the second one, and then they do one long, slow one that's 60 minutes. Now, the adherence to that would probably be challenging, but if you could do that for 8 weeks or 12 weeks, I would be really interested to see over a longer play. And the one thing the one reason why I'm interested in it, because I love endurance training, and I think that it has a big impact on sports like wrestling and combat sports that I'm in. But I've even seen it with some of the people I work with. It's like one guy here. Now this is only one case in this instance. Was 3 days a week we were doing endurance work, and he's on creatine, and literally just looking at the assault bike, because you can see the wattage output and you can see the RPM so easily. And we would go, okay, 60 RPMs. Okay, hold 60 RPMs for 5 minutes. And we were doing 5-minute tests. And by week 5, his heart rate plummeted on that 5-minute test. And I don't know. Obviously it's the impact from the aerobic work. But I would just be interested to see, like, is there an impact from creatine? If he wasn't on creatine, is that threshold where his heart rate plummeted because he just got in better shape? Would that be at 58 RPMs instead of 60? Like, I don't know. Maybe those 2 extra RPMs are because he's on creatine. He's a little bit more explosive.
For sure, yeah. And so I know there's other researchers that have studied it as well. So we looked at actually in females. We didn't find any benefit. The HIIT training was very effective, but there's a little bit more variability in the female population. We essentially replicated a previous study that was done in males, and they showed improvements in like power output at anaerobic threshold. Exactly what you're suggesting. So I do think, there could be some benefits of creatine for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting too. And when you were talking about like a sport like wrestling, because there's so much where you like slow and then you explode and then you slow, and it's like, man, it'd be real. That's a very, I like that idea. So there should be some more research in that. Okay, I wanted to get into some of the myths that I have, and I have so many freaking notes, and my brain, I have like 3 papers here, and then I have a screen over here. So, okay. In the case of, we went over most of this. Okay, loading. This is the one I remember I wanted to talk about. We talked about this 5 years ago too. Loading. When do you see loading being beneficial? Is it ever beneficial? Is it not beneficial? Should you be loading creatine if you're doing it for a certain goal, or what is the take on actually loading creatine or not?
So I guess I'll tell you, if you want to get creatine into your muscle as quickly as possible, then you can load, but in most situations it doesn't matter. And there's actually just it was an 8-week training study. And so they did resistance training with and without creatine. But there's actually 2 creatine conditions. There's actually 3, but So there was a creatine condition where they just got like a lower dose. They did not load. There was a second condition where they got the loading phase. They loaded for a week and then went to a maintenance dose. Then there was actually another condition where they got creatine HCl, so like an alternative form of creatine. And then they had a placebo condition. The creatine groups, they were all equally of benefit. So the creatine loading was not superior to not loading with regards to gains in muscle strength or muscle mass. And creatine HCl was not superior to creatine monohydrate. So I think that study was really cool, just to basically say that like you don't have to load with creatine. You can just take a lower dose of creatine. That's perfectly fine. And then also I hear a lot about creatine HCl being superior to creatine monohydrate. It works. It's an effective supplement, an effective form of creatine, but it's not superior to creatine monohydrate.
Yeah, that actually led into one of the guys put in the question for us. He goes, Creapure versus Amazon John creatine HCl, which one's better? And like that basically answers it. Where you're saying, look, it's probably, and I think Creapure, if I remember, is actually even a trademarked version of monohydrate, I think. So basically, loading, not loading, you don't have to load unless you really need it within a certain time frame. And then on top of that, over a 8 to 12 week time frame, you don't need to load. It's going to end up being, everything's going to end up being, saturated equally. And then on top of that, creatine monohydrate is going to be as good, possibly better, but as good as any other form of creatine, and it's the cheapest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, one thing I remember too discussing with you was, and I wanted to bring this up, was how long after you stop creatine can it stay saturated to a point in your muscles? And the reason I'm asking this is because if I have a wrestler or a weightlifter, and I remember Haley used to do this with my one girl, that we would be on creatine, and then we would have weigh-ins, let's say on a Wednesday, okay, and so she would compete on Wednesday. We might cut creatine out Saturday or Sunday in hopes to possibly lose a little bit of water to then help with the weigh-ins. Whether or not that was the right thing to do, I don't know, but I remember thinking she would still have enough creatine saturation. We would also take creatine post weigh-in to help with glycogen restoration, and then that was sort of how we played that game with the weight category. And I wanted to see, what is your take on creatine with weight class specific sports, essentially?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we need to do more research looking at like what happens to weight and also intracellular and extracellular water, even after 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then when you stop taking creatine. We do know that when you stop taking creatine, it takes 4 to 6 weeks to return to baseline. Okay. So it's like a slow process. So if you stop just a couple days beforehand, I don't think that's going to have a big effect. But also, we know that your body does a good job of kind of controlling the water within the cell anyways. So if you've been taking it for 8 weeks, it's not like you're retaining all this additional water. You just have kind of more weight to lose, I guess. So you would just lose it the same way that you always would for kind of a weight category athletes.
Okay, what about, is there anything around the glycogen restoration or anything around replenishment? Is there any evidence around that?
There is, yeah. There's multiple studies to basically show that if you combine creatine with carbohydrates, that you can, even within 24 hours, you can have more glycogen within your muscles, and that stays elevated for up to 6 days as well. Okay. So yeah, I think that's really important. That's a great strategy that you were doing. I'm not too sure about stopping it a couple days beforehand. I don't know if that had a big impact, but
I don't know either.
Yeah, it's possible, but yeah, we need more research to really kind of answer that question. But if I was kind of coaching the athlete at that time, I would just suggest continue to take creatine unless you were trying every strategy to lose every little bit of water and nothing else was working. But I think most athletes can just continue to take creatine right up to their fight, and then of course take it afterwards to help with that glycogen resynthesis.
Okay, so I'm even thinking about, because I have a lot of wrestlers. They're going to be weighing in. They'll weigh in next week, Big 12 championships, following or 2 weeks later the NCAA championships, and it's one of those things where it's like, really, unless they're struggling hard to make weight, just keep taking that creatine and stay dialed in, and it's probably going to help them. Now, with that being said, what do you recommend as far as what should you be taking creatine, consuming creatine with? I remember personally growing up, there was this crazy thought, and I don't know if this is accurate, that you shouldn't take it with orange juice. You should take it with apple juice, Gatorade, or milk. I haven't perpetuated the orange juice thing, but I wanted to see if you've ever heard anything as crazy as that, and if there's anything that stands behind those, what we should be using to actually consume it with.
So there is some evidence that combining creatine and protein, for example, can be of further benefit than just like protein supplementation or creatine alone. And the protein will stimulate insulin, similar to carbohydrates as well, and that can help with the creatine uptake. But once you're saturated with creatine, I honestly don't think it makes a big difference if you're co-ingesting creatine with other ingredients.
Okay.
But yeah, when you first start taking creatine, you're loading with it, then take it close to your exercise, because exercise stimulates the uptake of creatine into the muscle, and take it with some sort of other macronutrient that's going to stimulate insulin. So obviously you can take protein or carbohydrates will both stimulate insulin.
Okay. That makes sense. I was even just thinking about so MGF, I think it's mechano growth factor. Once you're and you basically just take it with protein. If you're going to take it with anything, take it timing wise. Timing doesn't necessarily mean a ton, except for in the beginning when you're starting to cycle on. Take it around when you're training. I wanted to ask though, did you ever hear anything about the orange juice thing, or is that just totally made up from the bodybuilding world?
I've never heard that before.
Okay.
Okay. But yeah, like orange juice will stimulate insulin.
Right.
So yeah, I think that'd be a fine strategy to actually co-ingest with creatine. But some of those co-ingestion studies, they actually use a lot of carbohydrates and a decent amount of protein as well. So it's not just like a little bit that's gonna, have this big insulin effect. They're actually consuming it with like 90 or 100 grams of carbohydrates.
Okay.
So, I'm not aware of any studies that have tried like smaller amounts of carbohydrates to see if that would actually improve creatine uptake. So I know I always say that, like, take creatine with carbohydrates or protein, but if you look at those studies, it was actually a lot of protein and a lot of carbohydrates.
What about when we're doing this, talking about this? What about, does caffeine have any positive or negative impact on creatine effectiveness?
I think if you're consuming like a cup of coffee, it's not going to negatively impact the effects of creatine. But if you have a really high dose of caffeine, it is possible to have a negative interaction. They kind of have opposing effects within the muscle, particularly on calcium handling. And so we actually did one study. So there was actually 4 groups in this study as well. We had creatine alone, creatine and caffeine, and a placebo group. And they trained, I think it was for 6 weeks. Can't remember the duration of the study, but either 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And we looked at how big their muscles got with an ultrasound. We look at muscle size. And we looked at the biceps, the triceps, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, and the calves. And there was no difference between the caffeine and creatine combined group compared to creatine alone, except for one of the muscle thickness measurements, the knee extensors of the quadriceps. creatine alone was a little bit better than the creatine and caffeine. So
That's interesting.
yeah, take it for what it's worth. That's one kind of outcome in a whole
So
bunch
that's
of
why my
outcomes.
quads are small. I have a lot of creatine with caffeine. That's why I have small quads.
Exactly, yeah. So mine are small because I generally skip leg day, but yeah, it's maybe if you're really concerned about that small interaction, maybe don't take a large amount of caffeine at the same time as you consume creatine. But as you mentioned previously, it doesn't matter when you take creatine. So just if you want to do that, take your caffeine before you exercise to get all jacked up, and then take creatine after you exercise.
Okay, so that it's a set. Yeah, that seems very reasonable right there. How you just described that. Now, one question I have is there in this case, have you ever had experiences with individuals in your studies that have digestive issues if they're consuming creatine, where they might have any type of digestive tract issues because creatine doesn't help them, or they don't sit well, or it takes a little bit of time for them to adapt to it?
For sure, yeah. And so that's maybe another consideration when you're trying to combine caffeine and creatine at the same time. Those can both cause a little bit of GI distress in some individuals. And it seems to be more related to that loading phase when you're taking like 20 grams a day versus if you're just taking 5 grams a day. The side effects are more prevalent in those higher doses. So if you do have somebody that has kind of GI distress with creatine, just suggest that they take it with food, and they can take smaller doses throughout the day, even as little as, taking 1 gram, maybe doing that 5 times throughout the day. You can actually absorb that creatine and get the benefits of the creatine, and it's going to lessen these side effects.
Okay, that makes sense. Is there anything specific that you've seen people try or take that have helped, even if, like, let's say that it's not the caffeine, let's say it's like just creatine in general, and they take another amino acid or another, compound or anything? Is there anything specifically that you've seen, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily, but often I like to know what brand of creatine they're using. And usually it's like some sort of Amazon HCl creatine mystery brand.
Cut with sand.
So, yeah. So I don't know. Just try a different brand of creatine, and just get creatine monohydrate powder if possible, and just see the effects of that.
Okay, I wanted to go into and I think this is a relevant topic for you and I, is like this question here, is that I'm bald because I took a lot of creatine. Is this a consistent that everyone who's taking creatine is likely going to end up being bald, or is there no connection to baldness with creatine?
This drives me nuts. So there was a study in 2009 that basically showed that DHT, which is a metabolite of testosterone, so that was increased in the creatine group, not the placebo. If you actually look at the study, like, the placebo group went down and the creatine group went up just slightly, but all within normal physiological ranges. And that study's never been replicated, but DHT has been linked to male pattern baldness. And yeah, if you look at, heavy creatine users such as yourself, if you look at myself, I have no hair. Dr. Darren Candow, no hair. Jose Antonio, no hair. Sergey Ostojic, great friend, creatine researcher, no hair. So we actually got fed up with this, and we ran a creatine hair loss study, and it's under review right now.
No way. Yes.
So, you'll find out soon, but I can tell you kind of the short answer is that 12 weeks of creatine supplementation has no effect on hair loss.
Okay, that's great. Hey, you know what's so ridiculous of this is I actually had a guy arguing with me that creatine causes hair loss, and he said that smoking cigars increases DHT, maybe, or no, decreases it, and that you could reverse male pattern balding by doing that. And I was like, wait, this is literally what these dudes think. Like, these guys will go on like bodybuilding.com forums and T Nation, and they actually think this stuff is real, and they just continue to spew it for their entire existence, and then when the kids come here, I have to be like, yo, dude, don't worry, you're not going to get bald if you're taking creatine.
Yeah, it was actually kind of an interesting study to write up because the scientific rationale of it is not there. There's
Right.
no
Right.
there's no mechanism that we're trying to it's basically enough people have made us upset on social media and made fun of my baldness and said it was associated. So we had to run this study. Please accept it. So
Yeah.
hopefully it gets accepted.
I love that one. I love that idea. Okay, I mean, a lot of people. I have a couple notes here. Some people were putting in, is creatine banned in sports? And my understanding is it's not a single sport that it's actually banned in. I don't know if you have any discussion on that or any points on that.
No, it's a safe and legal supplement from what I know.
Right.
I think in the NCAA or something there was something about they couldn't use supplements or maybe you can't maybe the schools weren't allowed to recommend supplements to to the
I think that's more along the lines of what it was. Yeah.
but it's definitely one of the safest supplements. And as if you're a football player, definitely consider creatine from the even the potential of it to be neuroprotective. If you get a concussion, the improvements in muscle performance, it's one of the safest supplements out there for sure.
I wanted to talk on two more things. So maybe actually let's go into cycling on and off. Should you cycle on and off before we get into the football part? I wanted to. Is there any evidence that you should cycle off or should cycle back on? Anything along those lines?
No one's done that study. My personal opinion is that from the muscle perspective, I don't think it really matters if you cycle on and off creatine. But from the brain, if you want the brain benefits, I think daily creatine supplementation becomes more important. And so that's usually my recommendation, is for people to take it daily. We actually did another review looking at studies that just took creatine on training days. And those studies, they trained 3 times a week. So there's been 4 of them versus taking it daily, for example. They just took those 4 studies, just took it on training days, just took creatine on training days compared to a placebo. And they showed that it was an effective supplement in those situations. So they were able to gain muscle mass and strength. We're actually running a study now looking at taking creatine just on training days versus taking creatine daily to see if there's a difference.
And that would be still at that 0.1 grams per kilo?
There was there was 4 different studies that compared it on just taking it on training days versus placebo. And I believe a couple of those were from Darren Kandow's lab that used that 0.1 grams per kilogram. Yeah.
Okay. And then I did want to get into, before we close out, the neuroprotective stuff. You were talking about 1, possibly for football, but 2, maybe even for other instances. Can you touch on neuroprotective qualities and even possibly concussion? And I think I wanted to bring this up too with the water retention. Is there water retention in the brain, and can that possibly be part of the protectiveness for concussions if it exists? So maybe just touch on what you know and what the research says as far as creatine and concussions.
For sure. So there's very limited human data, but there is one open labeled study, which basically means that the participants knew that they were receiving creatine. So I would say you need to be cautious with interpreting those findings, but they showed improved recovery following a traumatic brain injury. So They measured a whole bunch of kind of subjective questionnaires and symptoms, and they were improved with the creatine group, but they also knew that they were getting creatine. So we need to do more research in that area, but there's been some animal models where they used hypoxia, or a low amount of oxygen, and they induced brain damage with a low amount of oxygen. And they showed that you get less brain damage when you're taking creatine. So I think that animal data is pretty cool and pretty exciting. So if I'm a human, there's no downside to taking creatine, and there's a potential positive benefit to it. So that's why, if I was a football player, I would definitely be taking creatine just for the possibility that it could be neuroprotective.
Yeah, I actually just had a flashback while we were talking because I remembered. I swear this could be either deja vu or it's our last conversation. I think I brought up the fact that, okay, what could the argument be made that because my nervous system, or let's say my nervous system fires, right? Let's say I go to take a hit in football. My nervous system fires to, and it could in theory fire quicker so that I can have greater high threshold motor unit recruitment to then absorb or to then take the blow from a hit in football at a faster speed, which would then in turn have, if let's say it's my neck or my traps or whatever that are firing quicker to protect my brain, which would then have less brain movement inside of the skull because because I'm able to recruit faster. I don't know if that's making any sense at all or if I'm just making this up in my brain.
Well, yeah, like as you mentioned, if you can be stronger because of creatine supplementation, that's well established. If you combine it with resistance training, you're going to be stronger. Maybe you're less likely to kind of get the effects of a concussion as well. So not only is it having that direct impact on the brain, but just because you're stronger as well, maybe
you'll have more protective. Yeah. Okay. That was where I was going. I was trying to think through in my head how that worked, and I feel like I actually might have even brought that up before. And I think that's like all of these things. It's just like a consistent. I don't know. It's just constant. I guess that was another question I just saw. Like, what's the craziest myth that you've heard around creatine yourself?
Probably the hair loss one really pisses me off, or the kidney damage one is also quite prevalent because creatine, if you have more creatine in your body from supplementation, creatine is non-enzymatically degraded into a molecule called creatinine. And creatinine in a normal situation, if that starts to rise, that's like what doctors use to indicate some sort of dysfunction with your kidneys. But if you're supplementing with creatine, that can naturally rise a little bit, and it's nothing to be concerned about. But doctors freak out about it, and they won't measure anything else. And they just say like, oh, creatine's causing your kidneys to be damaged. And it's like, no, creatinine increased, and that's normal creatine metabolism. So if you want to actually measure creatine or kidney function, you should measure other things than creatinine. There's like cystatin C is a great marker that's not influenced by creatine supplementation. Or you need to measure creatinine clearance, not just in the bloodstream, but also in the urine, and see how your kidneys are actually filtering that creatinine.
So the myth around creatine causing kidney damage is highly likely just stemming from doctors ignoring simple creatine metabolism processes, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually wrote I wrote a manuscript with a nephrologist, and I was like, I don't feel comfortable here, like a kidney doctor, like this is going to be like writing about creatine. He's going to probably rip into it and forced me to write that creatine's bad for your kidneys. But we looked at all the evidence and we concluded that, creatine is very safe. And basically you need to be cautious with some of the markers that you're using to assess kidney function when you're on creatine supplementation. So it was a pretty cool paper, and I enjoyed that process and working with that doctor.
Could you send us that so we could link that in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then I got one more question, because I got my son, 13 years old, I think. So my oldest kid's 13, and I think this is a real common one. He's getting into lifting pretty heavily. He's genuinely eats pretty well. He's a pretty good kid. I'm not biased at all. But he starts asking things like, "Yeah, Dad, can I take creatine? Can I take whey protein?" And I'm like, Yeah, dude. Let's go. What would you do in that case? How do you feel about that? Like, do you think it's safe? Do you think it's something you can do, or do you think it's like, yo, let's just wait till you hit maybe some lifting benchmarks, which is actually what my dad did with us. Is he made us wait till we hit lifting benchmarks to start using it. So I wanted to see from Dr. Creatine, what is your take on that aspect?
Well, yeah, he needs to be benching at least 225.
Okay,
That's kind of the minimum. Well, minimum for any 13-year-old. No, he's it's perfectly fine. I would just personally, I'd probably start with a lower dose, and is kind of as maybe about 3 grams per day or 0.03 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. And yeah, I would just start there and see how they adapt to it, and then maybe also just cycle on and off of it, just again, so they're not taking supplements all the time. But yeah, that'd be my recommendation. And again, only for kids that are training consistently, doing kind of all the other things right. It's not necessary for everybody, but if they have an interest in it, and they can get some benefits from creatine supplementation.
Okay, one more, because I did bring this up. Has there ever been any research on creatine and attention deficit or anything like that having a positive impact?
I haven't seen those papers, but yeah, I've heard about that as well. I know for sure that creatine can impact the brain, and there's more and more research looking at like creatine and depression. So if you have higher creatine intake in your diet, you actually have a lower risk of depression, which is pretty cool. And there's a couple of randomized controlled trials that have now come out showing a link between creatine and depression, which is phenomenal. We also know that creatine can reduce anxiety as well. So it could be a benefit for ADHD. I've had that question as well, and other people have asked me. I think it's worth a shot.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like that's really I mean, I know I've said this like 3 times as the last question, but I could you touch on the depression part a little bit more, because I think that's a really important aspect. I mean, one, nutrition is plays so heavily on mental health, but even in this case, like look, good nutrition, good exercise, and creatine supplementation can help, along with other things that you could be working on. But this could be something that is beneficial. Maybe touch on, is there anything specific about the creatine that helps with depression that they know of in the processes of how your body uses it, or is it just sort of an observed aspect?
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, so I'm probably not the best to answer that. But I think it's important to understand that it was in combination with their medication that they're receiving. Okay. So it's not to suggest that stop taking your medication and take creatine and you'll be fine. Yeah, it's important to take medication in those instances, but creatine can be a benefit. And then those original studies just showed that association. So higher creatine intake in your diet, lower risk of depression, but those don't tell you causation. So you need to do those randomized controlled trials, but there are a couple now that show a relationship or show improvements with creatine supplementation. So I don't know the exact mechanisms, but we know that creatine works by providing more energy to the cells. So if you can, have a little bit more energy in the brain, maybe that could be a benefit for that population.
All right. Dr. Scott Forbes, thanks so much for doing this. I think this is an hour and 10 minutes of straight just every myth that you could ever come up with. Like I'm telling you, I have just pages of questions, and I'm like, I've asked you everything, and you've answered as clearly as absolutely possible. So thanks for being on, and I did want to just send you my gratitude and thanks for doing this, because it's so fun, it's so enlightening, and it's something that helps me as a coach. And I think that literally today I will go downstairs and have direct impact on kids and parents and stuff, that we can just help educate people on what creatine is and what it can do and how it can be beneficial in certain cases. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem at all. Happy to be here. And what you do is awesome as well. So no one reads my papers, to be honest. It's maybe my mom and a few like other creatine researchers, but we need to translate that information. So podcasts like this are super important.
And what we want to do, we'll have some of the stuff in the show notes. If you could send maybe, I don't know, like 3 to 5 and then over, and we could put them in there. And then we'll also have your handle so people can find you and stalk you on Instagram.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Forbes. I'll see you soon. Hopefully.
Okay, bye.
Later.